Pelican Point, April 15th, 1895. The wind did not blow across Utah Lake so much as it possessed it, a shifting wall of pressure that drove the ice floes against the shoreline with the sound of grinding molars. For the sheep herder picking his way through the sagebrush and the thawing mud, the sound was a constant companion, a low, earthen groan that signaled the end of a punishing winter. He was looking for strays. The spring thaw was treacherous. The ice, once a solid highway for wagons and horses, was now rotting from the inside out, turning into a gray slush that could swallow a man whole. The air smelled of wet wool and the deep, organic rot of the lake bottom churning up for the season. He stopped. 50 yards out, caught in a tangle of reeds and broken ice, something broke the gray monotony of the water. It bobbed with a terrifying, rhythmic sluggishness. A log? A drowned calf? The herder squinted against the flat, metallic glare of the sun. The shape was too specific. It had the geometry of a man. He didn't run. In the hardscrabble west of 1895, death was a neighbor you expected to see on the porch. He waded out. The water numbed his boots instantly. The mud sucked at his heels. As he drew closer, the details resolved with sickening clarity. A heavy coat, waterlogged and black. A boot, pointing aimlessly at the sky. And then, the face. The water had been cold enough to preserve the flesh, but cruel enough to erase the humanity. It was a mask of wax, pale and bloated, stripped of expression by the weeks of submersion. But the herder knew who it was. The whole county had been waiting for this ghost to rise. It was Albert Enstrom, and he was not alone. The lake was finally giving up its dead. To understand the horror of the end, you must understand the quiet of the beginning. Pelican Point was not a town. It was an exile. Jutting out into the western edge of Utah Lake, it was a thumb of land composed of limestone and solitude. In 1895, it was a place where the map seemed to fade. To live there was to accept a pact with isolation. There were no street lamps to push back the night, no neighbors within shouting distance, just the wind, the water, and the relentless sky. But for Albert Enstrom, it was a kingdom. At 22, Albert was the definition of the frontier promise. He was built from the kind of wire muscle stamina that the era demanded. A young man with a vision that extended beyond the next harvest. He had come down from the mining town of Eureka, leaving behind the dark, lung-choking tunnels for the open air of his mother's ranch. He didn't see the desolation of Pelican Point. He saw an empire of cattle and alfalfa. He wasn't alone in this venture. He had brought his kin, his cousins, Andrew Johnson and Alfred Nelson. Andrew, 20, was the steady hand. Quiet, dependable. The kind of man who measured his words as carefully as he measured feed. Alfred was the baby of the group, only 17. At 17 in 1895, you were a man by labor standards, but a boy by experience. He was there because family went where family was needed. Picture them in the dead of January. The cabin is small, a rough-hewn box against the elements. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, frying bacon, and damp wool. They are talking about fences, about the spring drive, about the girls they might court. They are invincible, as all young men are. They believe that if they work hard enough, the land will love them back. They did not know that the land was indifferent. And they did not know that the threat wasn't the winter outside, but the greed of men. The calendar turned to February. The winter of 1895 was a beast that turned the lake into a sheet of steel thick enough to support a team of horses. On February 16th, the three cousins hitched up their wagon. They had business in Lehigh, a legal hearing. It was a mundane bureaucratic affair, a dispute involving Albert's stepfather, a man named Harry Hayes. They testified. They walked the streets of the town. They were seen by dozens of people. They were alive, vibrant, part of the fabric of the community. Late that afternoon, they turned their wagon west, back toward the ice, back toward the ranch. They were never seen alive again. The silence that followed wasn't immediate. In the West, days could pass without contact. But the silence at Pelican Point had a texture to it. A week passed, then 2. Neighbors began to notice the stillness. No smoke curled from the chimney. The cattle were lowing. A distress call that carried for miles in the thin air. In early March, Caroline Hayes, Albert's mother, could stand the quiet no longer. She traveled to the ranch. Her heart hammered a warning rhythm against her ribs. What she found was more haunting than a crime scene. The cabin was locked tight. She forced the door. Inside, the air was stale and freezing. The clock had stopped. But the table was set. Plates were laid out for dinner. A pan sat on the cold stove, the food within congealed and ancient. Their work clothes were there. Their Sunday best was missing. The clothes they had worn to court. But their everyday boots, their heavy winter coats, some were missing. Some remained. It was as if they had been plucked from the earth by a giant hand. The wagon was gone. The team of horses was gone. The boys were gone. But the most chilling detail was the dog. The ranch dog, usually a barking sentinel, was cowering, skittish and terrified. It had seen something that had broken its spirit. Caroline went to the law. Sheriff George Storrs, a man with a heavy mustache and eyes that had seen the worst of human nature. But what could he do? The lake was frozen. The snow was deep. There were no bodies, no blood, no weapon. Just a vacuum where 3 lives used to be. Rumors filled the void. They went to Arizona for work, some said. They struck gold and ran off, said others. But Caroline knew. A mother knows the difference between adventure and oblivion. Then came the April thaw. The ice cracked. The fissures ran like lightning bolts across the surface. And the lake began its confession. After the sheepherder found Albert on April 15th, the search began in earnest. Boats were launched. Grappling hooks dragged the silt. 5 days later, on April 20th, the lake surrendered the others. Andrew Johnson and Alfred Nelson were found 3 miles away, drifting in the reeds. When the coroner examined them, the runaway theory evaporated. This was not an accident. This was not a drowning. Albert had been shot in the head. Andrew had been shot in the head. Alfred, the 17-year-old boy, had been shot in the head. The caliber was small, a revolver, a close-range weapon. The forensic narrative began to construct itself in the minds of the detectives, and it was a nightmare. They hadn't been killed in a fight. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle on their hands. The theory was sickeningly simple. They had been asleep, or they had been trusted. Someone had walked into that cabin or stopped them on the ice and executed them with the efficiency of slaughtering livestock. They had then loaded the warm bodies into their own wagon, driven them out onto the frozen lake, cut a hole in the ice, and pushed them into the black water, hoping they would stay down forever. But the lake had refused to keep the secret. The gases of decomposition had inflated the bodies, bringing them up from the depths just as the ice gave way. This was the most atrocious crime in Utah's history, the newspapers screamed. The grief turned instantly to rage. 3 boys, cousins, dead for months while their families hoped for a letter from Arizona. The killer had walked among them, perhaps sat in church with them, while the boys rotted under the ice. Who had the malice? Who had the coldness to shoot a sleeping boy? The eyes of the law and the eyes of the lynch mob turned in unison toward one man. A man who didn't seem to care that his stepson was dead. A man who had been fighting with Albert over the very land where the blood was spilled. Harry Hayes. In the lexicon of criminal psychology, we look for the incongruous reaction, the behavior that doesn't fit the script of grief. When a child is murdered, we expect the parents to collapse. We expect rage, hysteria, a desperate, clawing need for answers. Harry Hayes offered a shrug. Hayes was a man carved from the roughest flint of the era. He was not a biological father to Albert. He was the stepfather, a role that in 1895 carried a distinct emotional distance. But even by those standards, his coldness was glacial. When the bodies were pulled from the lake, dripping with slime and tragedy, Hayes stood on the periphery. He didn't wail. He didn't comfort his wife, Caroline, whose world had just been shattered. Instead, he complained about the investigation. He complained about the intrusion. To the tight-knit Mormon community of Utah County, this wasn't just suspicious. It was moral heresy. In a culture built on family and shared suffering, Hayes was an alien creature. He was, as the local papers dubbed him, an eccentric and mean old cuss. But being mean isn't a capital crime. Murder is. Sheriff Storrs, under immense pressure to solve the crime of the century, began to pull at the threads of Hayes's life. What he found was a tapestry of motive that seemed almost too perfect. The motive was the oldest in the book: land. The ranch at Pelican Point technically belonged to Caroline, Albert's mother. But Albert, ambitious and headstrong, had been bossing the place. He was acting like the owner, making improvements, buying stock. Hayes, it was whispered, hated this. He saw the boy as a usurper. He wanted to sell the land, take the cash, and move on. Albert was the obstacle. And the cousins, Andrew and Alfred, they were collateral damage, witnesses to a dispute that had turned lethal. The investigation moved with the clumsy but inexorable force of a steam engine. In late 1895, Hayes was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial was a spectacle. The courtroom in Provo was packed to the rafters, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and tobacco. Men and women traveled for days just to catch a glimpse of the monster of Pelican Point. The prosecution didn't have a smoking gun. They didn't have a witness who saw Hayes pull the trigger. What they had was a thicket of circumstantial evidence, a dense, thorny collection of facts that, when woven together, formed a cage. Witnesses took the stand, their voices trembling with the gravity of the oath. They swore they had heard Hayes threaten Albert. "I'll kill you before I let you take this land," one claimed to have heard. Another spoke of Hayes waving a pistol, his face purple with rage during an argument at the dinner table. Hayes owned a .38 caliber revolver, the same caliber found in the boys' skulls. In 1895, ballistics was in its infancy. There was no rifling analysis to match the specific bullet to the specific gun. But the coincidence was damning enough for the jury. A neighbor testified to seeing a wagon moving on the ice late on the night of February 16th. It was heading away from the ranch. The driver was a silhouette, hunched against the cold. "Looked like Hayes," the witness said. It was a statement born of suggestion, not certainty. But in the heat of the trial, it hardened into fact. But a good narrative, like a good investigation, is never a straight line. There were other names whispered in the saloons of Lehigh. Oliver Slade. Slade was a neighbor, a man who had feuded with the Enstrom family for years. He had evicted them from a property once. There was bad blood, the kind that festers over property lines and water rights. He was a hard man, capable of violence. For a moment, the defense tried to pivot. "Look at Slade," they cried. He had the anger, he had the proximity, but the thicket around Hayes was too dense. Slade was cleared quickly. Too quickly, perhaps. He had an alibi, weak but corroborated. And more importantly, he didn't act guilty. He didn't have Hayes's terrifying apathy. The public had already cast their villain, and they didn't want to recast. They wanted the stepfather. Let us use the accordion to expand this moment, for this is where the tragedy compounds. Imagine the courtroom on the day of the verdict, the dust motes dancing in the shafts of afternoon light, the judge, a bearded patriarch, looking down from the bench, the jury, 12 men of the soil, their faces grim. They had listened for days. They had heard Caroline Hayes weep for her son. They had watched Harry Hayes sit stone-faced, picking at his fingernails, staring at the wall as if he were waiting for a train, not a death sentence. The prosecutor, sensing the bloodlust in the room, painted a picture of demonic greed. He described the cold night, the sleeping boys, the stepfather creeping in with the revolver. Pop, 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 the silence returning, the labor of dragging the bodies, the cold calculation of the ice hole. Only a monster could do this, he thundered, and there sits the monster. The jury didn't need long. They deliberated, but the verdict was written on their faces before they left the box. Guilty. The judge donned the black cap. He sentenced Harry Hayes to be hanged by the neck until dead. Hayes didn't flinch. He didn't scream his innocence. He just blinked, as if he had misheard the price of a sack of flour. The town exhaled. Justice had been done. The bad actor had been caught. The red flags, the lack of empathy, the greed, the threats, they had been validated. They could sleep again. But there was one man in the room who wasn't sleeping. Sheriff George Storrs. Storrs had arrested Hayes. He had built the case. He had testified against him. But as he looked at the condemned man, a cold knot of doubt began to form in his gut. It was too clean. It was too reliant on character assassination and not enough on hard evidence. And then, a whisper reached him. A rumor from the edges of the county. A story about a wagon seen miles away. Driven not by Hayes, but by a stranger, a man with shifting eyes and a history of disappearing. A man named George H. Wright. While Hayes sat on death row, counting the days until the rope, Storrs went back to work. He began to pick at the thicket he himself had helped grow. He looked at the timeline again. The boys were killed on the night of the 16th. Hayes was seen in Eureka, miles away, the next day. Could he have made the trip? Yes. But it would have been brutal. And the stolen goods, the boys' bedding, their guns, the wagon. None of it had been found at Hayes' property. A man killing for land doesn't steal dirty quilts. A man killing for land doesn't steal a wagon he can't use. That sounds like the crime of a drifter. That sounds like the crime of a man who lives on the road. Storrs pulled the file on George H. Wright, also known as the Drifter, also known as a cattle rustler. Wright had been in the area. Wright had been seen trying to sell a team of horses that matched the description of the Enstrom team. The sheriff felt the blood drain from his face. They were about to hang a man for being unlikable, while a triple murderer was walking free. The gallows were built. The rope was measured. In the spring of 1898, Harry Hayes sat in a damp stone cell, staring at a calendar that was rapidly running out of days. He had been a condemned man for 2 years, his appeals exhausted, his name synonymous with fratricide. But outside the prison walls, the man who had put him there was not celebrating. Sheriff George Storrs was a man of the law, but he was also a man of instinct, and his instinct was screaming. The conviction of Hayes had been a triumph of narrative over evidence. It fit the story the town wanted, the wicked stepfather. But it didn't fit the physical facts that Storrs kept turning over in his mind during sleepless nights. The quilts. Why would Harry Hayes, a man who owned a home and land, murder 3 boys and then steal their old dirty quilts? Why would he steal a wagon he couldn't use without being recognized? These were the crimes of a man who needed shelter. A man who was moving. A man who had nothing. Storrs did something rare for a lawman of that era. He admitted he might be wrong. He took his doubts to Governor Heber Wells. He laid out the inconsistencies. He argued that the state of Utah was about to commit a murder of its own. The governor listened. In a move that shocked the blood-hungry public, the sentence was commuted. Hayes was not hanged. He was eventually pardoned and released. The town was furious. They spat at Hayes in the street. They called Storrs a traitor. But Storrs didn't care. He had a new target. He had found the loose thread in the tapestry, and he was pulling it with obsessive force. The thread led to a name, George H. Wright. To the people of Pelican Point, Wright had been a ghost, a sometime laborer, a drifter who passed through town, worked a few days for a hot meal, and moved on. He was charming when he needed to be, invisible when he didn't. But as Storrs dug into Wright's history, a terrifying profile emerged. This was not just a drifter. This was a predator. Wright, also known by the alias James G. Weeks, was a cattle rustler. But he was more than a thief. He was a violent opportunist. Storrs discovered that Wright had been in the vicinity of Pelican Point in February 1895. He had been seen riding a horse that looked suspiciously like one of Albert Enstrom's. Then came the testimony of Wright's estranged wife, Jenny. Jenny was a woman living in fear. When Storrs finally tracked her down, she broke. She told him that in the days following the boy's disappearance, Wright had come home acting wild. He was nervous, prostrated by a sudden, inexplicable illness. He had forbidden her from asking questions. And then, the clincher. She had seen him burning clothes. She had seen him with a Spencer rifle, the very make of rifle missing from the Enstrom cabin. The picture snapped into focus. This wasn't a crime of inheritance. It was a crime of opportunity. The boys hadn't been killed for the land. They had been killed for their gear, for a wagon, for a few horses, for quilts. The banality of the motive made it infinitely more horrific. Harry Hayes had hated the boys, yes, but George H. Wright hadn't cared about them at all. To him, they were just obstacles between him and a payout. The narrative now shifts from a stagnant courtroom drama to a kinetic Western thriller. Storrs was no longer an investigator. He was a hunter. He issued warrants. He sent telegrams. He mobilized a manhunt that spanned the harsh, unforgiving terrain of the Intermountain West. But Wright was a creature of the open spaces. He knew how to disappear into the sagebrush ocean. He moved from Utah to Colorado, changing names like other men, changed shirts. The red flags were everywhere now, blazing like signal fires. Wright wasn't just hiding. He was escalating. In 1896, while Hayes was sitting on death row for a crime he didn't commit, Wright was in Colorado, and he was killing again. Reports reached Storrs of a man named William Crampton, murdered in Colorado under strikingly similar circumstances. Shot, robbed, his possessions taken by a traveling companion who vanished into the wind. Storrs realized with a sickening jolt that he was chasing a serial killer. The term didn't exist yet. They called them fiends or monsters. But the pathology was clear. Wright was a man without a conscience. A shark swimming through the desert, feeding whenever he was hungry. Storrs traveled to Colorado. He rode hundreds of miles. He interviewed saloon keepers, stable boys, and terrified women. A witness would say, "He was here 3 days ago, called himself Weeks, sold a horse, and rode south. 3 days. Always 3 days behind." The frustration was physical. You must imagine the heat of the chase. The dust clogging Storrs' throat. The exhaustion of the saddle. The bitter taste of knowing that every day Wright remained free was a mockery of the 3 boys rotting in the Benjamin Cemetery. Storrs was trying to outrun time. He knew that in the West, a man could simply walk off the map. There were no databases, no fingerprints, no radios. If Wright made it to Mexico or deep into the masquerade of a mining camp, he was gone forever. The climax of the hunt came in 1897. A tip placed Wright in a specific canyon, holed up with a gang of rustlers. Stores organized a posse. They rode hard, weapons drawn, ready for the shootout that would end the nightmare. They kicked down the door of the shack. The coffee pot was still warm. A cigarette smoldered in an ashtray. But the room was empty. Wright had slipped away again. He had sensed the vibration of the hooves in the earth. Or perhaps the wind had whispered a warning. He was gone. The failure of justice. The trail didn't just go cold, it froze, much like the lake that had started it all. Years passed. Sightings of Wright dwindled. Some said he died in a bar fight in Texas. Others said he went to Alaska for the gold rush. In 1914, a glimmer of hope appeared. A man named W.E. Davis was arrested in Los Angeles. He was old, broken, and drunk. He started talking. He confessed to killing 3 men in Utah years ago. He knew details, the ice, the wagon. The newspapers exploded. Pelican Point murderer found. But when the lawmen arrived to interrogate him, the fog of dementia and alcoholism obscured the truth. Davis's story changed. The details blurred. Was he the killer? Or just a man who had heard the story around a campfire and internalized it? There was no proof, no confession that stuck. Davis took his secrets, or his delusions, to the grave. Sheriff Storrs, now an old man, had to accept the bitter reality. He had saved an innocent man from the gallows, yes. That was a victory. But he had failed to catch the devil. Harry Hayes died a pariah, despised by a town that never fully believed his innocence. George H. Wright lived on, a phantom in the peripheral vision of history. And the boys, they were the silent center of the storm. The hunt had moved so far beyond them. It had become about jurisdiction and ego and the mechanics of the law. But back at Pelican Point, the wind still blew over the spot where they had died. There was no gavel bang to end the story of the Pelican Point murders. There was only the slow, eroding wind of time. The climax of a true crime story is usually the snap of handcuffs or the reading of a sentence. But in the reality of 1895, the climax was a vacuum. It was the moment the trail went cold. Harry Hayes, the man the town wanted to hang, lived out his days in a purgatory of his own making. He had been pardoned by the governor, but he was never pardoned by his neighbors. Mothers would pull their children close when he passed. Men would spit in the dust after he walked by. He died a bitter, isolated man, carrying the stigma of a triple murder he likely didn't commit, but for which he lacked the grace to be forgiven. And George H. Wright? He won. It is a hard pill for the modern mind to swallow. We are trained to expect the third act takedown, but Wright dissolved into the American landscape. He became a campfire story. A boogeyman used to frighten children. Don't wander off, or Old Man Wright will get you. He had exploited the fatal flaw of the frontier, anonymity. He knew that a man could shed his name as easily as a snake sheds its skin. He proved that if you are mobile enough and ruthless enough, you can outrun the law. Let us leave the killers. They do not deserve the final word. Travel with me now, away from the desolate, wind-scoured shoreline of Pelican Point. Travel south to the small, quiet farming community of Benjamin, Utah. Walk through the iron gates of the cemetery. The grass is green here, watered by the descendants of the pioneers. The air is still. Find the plot where 3 headstones stand shoulder to shoulder. Albert Enstrom, Andrew Johnson, Alfred Nelson. They are together in the earth. The inscription on their monument is a haunting cry from the past. It reads, "But truth shall conquer at the last. For round and round we run, and ever the right comes uppermost, and ever is justice done." It is a beautiful lie. Justice was not done. Not in a courtroom. Not at the end of a rope. The right did not come uppermost. The killer walked free, and the innocent man was destroyed. But look closer at the dates. Look at the ages. 22, 20, 17. The tragedy isn't just the violence of their deaths, it is the theft of their futures. Albert never built his ranch. Andrew never married. Alfred never grew out of boyhood. The echo of Pelican Point is not the sound of the gunshot. It is the silence of the lives that were never lived. Stand on the shore of Utah Lake one last time. It is winter again. The ice is forming. The cabin is long gone. The wagon tracks have been washed away 1,000 times over. The modern world has built highways and cities around the lake. But if you stand at the point, looking west, the isolation is still absolute. The wind hits your face with the same biting indifference it held in 1895. It whispers across the ice. It reminds us that the abyss is not some distant, mythical place. It is right here, beneath the surface of the familiar. It is in the thin layer of ice that separates the living from the dead. It is in the trusting nature of 3 boys who opened their door to the wrong man. And it is in the chilling realization that sometimes the only witness to the truth is the silence itself. That was Pelican Point, written and read by the author, me, James Cawley. If you like stories like this, stories that linger like a chill you can't quite shake, slow burning and rooted in the forgotten places where the earth holds its breath, then you're in the right place. I'm glad we found you. My name is James Cawley, and you're listening to Dust and Echoes. I release a new story in cinematic audiobook format every single week, right here. Until next time, remember this. The most profound ghosts are not the ones who return to haunt us, but the versions of ourselves that we were never given the time to meet.
Just an echo.